and welcome to Nirmal Bang, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Hiral Dadia. We have with us Abhishek Rastogi, as always, giving us insights of what we could actually make from the budget 2022. Abhishek, overall, if you go to see a lot of comments that are floating in that one, yes, it is a growth-oriented budget. Two, it is a capex-heavy budget. What is your first initial takeaway out of the same?
So, as a tax expert, I would say that it's lukewarm because there were not many announcements per se in the budget speech. But when you go to the detailing, there are a lot of amendments. There are a lot of proposals with respect to hike in customs duty rate. There are changes for various aspects related to customs. There are changes in GST law as well. And there are plethora of changes in direct tax regime as well. Of course, it's not a very populist one from the tax perspective or from the perspective of the middle income group, because there are no changes to the tax slabs and so on and so forth. But overall, yes, from the policy framework, it's an interesting one. Some of these announcements are very, very interesting and pragmatic, including the one related to the virtual currencies.
Right. And overall, especially focusing on the taxation side of it, one is that they've allowed taxpayers to file updated returns within 2 years for correcting errors. How big a positive will that be?
See, I think it is very, very pragmatic step. See, imagine in the era of this pandemic, a lot of people may have missed the deadlines. There could have been certain incomes which may have left to be disclosed. Now, this option is a very pragmatic one in the sense that, it's a mechanism of voluntary compliance. So if you have missed, don't worry, pay the tax till the time the government gets the tax on time, there is no problem. So I think from that perspective, from the perspective of compliances, it's a very, very welcome move.
Right. And does this actually mean that someone who has paid, put their returns through and they want any corrections on that front? Or does this also apply to taxpayers who probably missed filing taxes for 1 year and they could do the filings as well?
This is predominantly on the point where you have escaped some sort of disclosure with respect to an income. So which means that if your income actually was 120 rupees, but you disclosed only to the extent of 100 rupees, then the balance of 20 rupees you could disclose by way of additional compliance.
Right. So someone who's missed filing returns will not be able to take advantage of this, right?
So I would say that, once you missed filing the return, you have not disclosed income to that extent, to the 100% extent, and you could still get that benefit.
Correct. Moving from there on, in terms of the other tax proposals that came in with regards to tax relief to persons with disability or reducing the alternate minimum tax rate and surcharge for cooperatives, what do you make of these relief measures?
See, so basically, as far as the cooperatives are concerned, all of these cooperatives today are now at par after this proposal. So which means that the additional surcharge brunt which was applicable on them is no longer there. So, these are at par with other corporates or entities and so on and so forth, which is very, 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 very welcome thing to happen. Now, with respect to your other question, that with respect to the health benefit or the health insurance which comes to the physically challenged individuals, the proposal very clearly and compassionately gives the benefit in those cases wherein the person who takes care of that individual exceeds the age of 60 years. And so that benefit of insurance is not only available now only at the time of death of that person who takes care, but otherwise as well once the age threshold is crossed. So I think a very compassionate move by the finance minister.
Right. And overall, from the employee perspective as well, Abhishek, the tax deduction limit on employers' contribution to NPS account of the state government employees has been increased as well. What would that actually translate into?
See, I think that is a mechanism to increase savings in a more pragmatic fashion. And I think that will be beneficial in the long run for each of these people who are contributing or would get the benefit at some stage in future. So from that perspective, I think this is again the move keeping in mind the savings and investments perspective.
Right. And overall, coming on the cryptocurrency side as well, I mean, we could call it virtual assets. The income from transfer of virtual assets to be taxed at 30%. And secondly, better litigation management is something that they're looking at to avoid repetitive appeals on it as well. How big a move is this going to be, taking the virtual asset market, which is really unregulated? People have been looking at it as well.
Very interesting. So I think there are 5 important elements there. You are taxing the virtual asset at 30%. I do not have a big problem, because in any case, most of these virtual assets will be bought by people who would be ideally in the 30% bracket. Now, if people below that bracket are involving themselves in virtual assets, then let that transaction be taxed at 30%. I do not have much of a problem there. With respect to the second issue, 1% TDS on such transactions, still I do not have a problem, because it improves the compliance. What happens by this is that the compliance for each and every sale and purchase transaction comes into the loop of tax, because every TDS collected would be reflected in the system, and hence there will be a tracking mechanism by way of artificial intelligence or otherwise. So I think the second element is also fine and must be fine for all stakeholders. The third point is a killer, and that point is that these crypto assets or virtual assets, there is always a risk of these being stolen, lost, theft, and so on and so forth. Now the proposals say that if you lose this asset, or if there is a theft of this asset because of any crime which happens, the cyber crime and so on and so forth, you would not get the deduction of that asset. Now, this is very killing. So, for example, if the asset is lost, which means that there is a transfer of the asset. Now, if the transfer of the asset has happened, there is a decrease in the asset, will that asset be considered as sold? And even in cases of lost or theft or cyber crimes, will a person be liable to pay tax at the rate of 30%? That will be a killer. There are more questions today than answers on that aspect. The fourth element with respect to crypto assets, very interesting, is that they say that if there is a gift of the crypto asset, there is no deduction or the transaction is taxable. So as per the Indian laws, Income Tax Act or inheritance laws and so on and so forth, if the gift happens in certain cases or inheritance happens in certain cases, the transaction is not taxed under income tax and so on and so forth, and never at a rate of 30%. Now imagine crypto assets being given by will or by way of a gift from the father to the son, or by someone in will and who's no more there, the deceased. Then will that be subject to again 30%? Is what the proposal says, because it says that the gift will be taxed at 30%. So we will have to go into those details for sure. Last but not the least, while these 4 points have been very categorically announced with respect to crypto assets, there is no mention with respect to the GST treatment of these crypto assets. So what will be the value of taxation? So if I bought Bitcoin for $10,000 and I sold it for $20,000, or let's say in my example for $15,000, will you tax from the GST perspective only the differential between the $15,000 and the $10,000, the $5,000, or will you tax the entire value of $15,000 once again by saying that cryptocurrencies are either goods or services, whereas the answer could completely change the dynamics of doing business with respect to crypto assets in India. And in those cases, people may be forced to have wallets outside of India, have banking accounts outside of India, invest through the banking account outside of India, in a wallet outside of India, in an exchange outside of India. So I think those questions need to be answered for certainty. And of course, NFTs, there is no mention about the NFTs, but would cryptocurrencies, the way this will be defined in the bill, will that include the non-fungible tokens as well? So that will open the Pandora box, because non-fungible tokens, these NFTs, etc., will have completely different set of dynamics. So And what happens when these NFTs are situated outside of India? So will the income deemed to accrue outside of India or in India will remain a question mark?
Absolutely. And I think, Abhishek, to what the fine print reads, that's why I think they've called it virtual assets as well, which does not really restrict it to cryptocurrencies or digital currencies. It actually expands the purview to NFTs and any other virtual assets that could emerge in the future as well. So I think that's something which is kept pretty open. Secondly, in terms of where incentives for startups are concerned, that's something which they've taken into consideration on the taxation side as well, especially for the newly incorporated manufacturing entities under the concessional tax regime. Do you think that is something which will be a big benefit to the MSMEs and the startups?
See, I think the finance minister is very clear. If she has to attain the growth rate of 8% plus, she has to encourage the MSME sector. Now, we have spoken about the tax buoyancy and the fiscal deficit. Now, if the GDP growth rate has to be at 8% plus, and we know for a fact that now we are in the growth rate of the pre-pandemic period. Now, if that has to happen, the MSME sector has to be encouraged. Now, how do you encourage that? How do you encourage the indigenous manufacturing? Is by extending these benefits, including these benefits of tax holidays and tax incentives. So I think extension of this incorporation period for which they could take these benefits is a very, very welcome move. Is this period enough in terms of the announcements which have happened today? Perhaps the extension may happen once more for one more year, keeping the overall environment in mind. But for the time being, this is a very welcome move, and a lot of these MSMEs will get that benefit.
Right. And overall, apart from that, any key highlights on the indirect taxation front as well? Because there has been some remarkable progress in terms of GST collections overall. A couple of comments that came in on the special economic zones as well. And additionally, rationalization with regards to where custom duties is concerned. So how would you sum up the entire speech with regards to the indirect taxation front?
See, I think the categorical mention with respect to the GST collection, 1.4 trillion in the month of Jan is very encouraging, because we were expecting 1 trillion on an average for every month. But now this has gone beyond 40% to that expected cash collection on the front of GST. So I think that's very encouraging. That gives Finance Minister a way out to manage her tax buoyancy and reduce fiscal deficit. That goes without saying. So I think that's on her mind, and that was not part of the budget speech today, but she still mentioned. Now, what she intends to do on the GST front, couple of interesting aspects. What she intends to do is to ensure that the credit which a person gets is all monitored. There is no lapse or there is no duplication, and there is no fraud with respect to the credits. So I think that's the fundamental change which has been announced, and which has also come by way of amendments to certain sections proposed in the finance bill. So that's very important. Secondly, they have taken certain measures by which they're saying that the two-way communication or the matching concept of the return between the vendor and the buyer may not be relevant, because we will be strict on the availment per se. So once they are sure that the amount of tax has been paid by the vendor, and that is appropriately communicated by way of these digital forms, etc., to the person who avails the credit, there'll be more control by way of systems. So that has been designed rightly so, for the reasons that there must not be any fraud, there must not be any duplication, and so on and so forth. At the same time, they have given some benefits in terms of extension of time to avail these credits. They have extended it by a month or so, by 2 months or so that people can avail these benefits in a longer duration of time. Similarly, they have at the same time ensured that there are certain strict provisions such as registration. So they are saying that we would cancel the registration in case you lapse on the compliances. So I think overall, from the perspective of GST, they have made some of these interesting changes and have given relaxation for things such as interest. So when would interest be made applicable? Will it be applicable only when you avail the credit, or when you avail and utilize the credit? Industry was demanding that for a long time, and this will now be incorporated by way of appropriate amendment. So I think from the GST perspective, those broad changes have come, keeping the overall numbers in mind. Now, coming on to the customs side of it, of course, there are certain important amendments which have been announced with respect to SEZ. That entire thing will be replaced now, so that there are more robust provisions in place. We need to ensure that there are lesser checks and the ease of doing business improves, and at the same time there are more stakeholders which come into the participative mode, and the entire revamp of this SEZ Act will happen in such a way so that the imports and the way these imports are happening becomes easier. So I think those are the changes which have been suggested. But I think one very important element with respect to these changes is the powers of the DRI officers. Supreme Court in Canon India decision recently and other decisions which I am also arguing before various courts we have disputed the powers of these officers and these DRI officers, and at which level could these show cause notices or summons must be issued. So there is a retrospective amendment to address that issue. We will still have to see that whether that retrospective amendment is constitutionally valid or not. I would not want to comment on that as of now, but yes, a lot of past litigation which is there may again come into foray and play if the powers of the DRI are there with respect to these changes. So I think that will have to be seen. Next interesting element with respect to customs is agricultural infrastructure and development cess. Now we must explain it very categorically that in all cases the duty burden will not increase, because for these items the corresponding basic customs duty has come down. So when this agricultural cess is levied, so there is reduction in basic customs duty, but there is an introduction of this cess. The objective of imposing this cess is very clear, that the amount collected is used only for agricultural purpose and doesn't go to the common pool by way of consolidated fund, and it doesn't get shared with the state and so on and so forth. So I think very categorically this cess levied on these products will be used for agricultural purposes. So I think those are some of these basic changes with respect to customs, apart from some rate increases which have happened for protectionist measures, because the government wants indigenous manufacturing to improve. They would want certain items to be more expensive when they are imported, and such of these examples could be umbrellas, black, carbon black, raw silk, silk yarn, some compressors with respect to refrigerators and all, and some solar inverters. So I think these products have been specifically identified to ensure that whether we have today the manufacturing capability with respect to these. And on the other side, for some of these products, we have seen that the government wants to give PLI scheme incentives. The government wants the domestic manufacturing and production to improve and increase. So if that has to happen, they need to ensure that the cost of import of these goods is increased, and hence categorically these decisions have been taken.
Right. And very lastly, Abhishek, overall, if you go to see, apart from the points that we've discussed already, any highlights that one needs to note?
I think one is certainly on the advance ruling. So now what is being proposed is that the advance ruling. So what is advance ruling? Advance ruling is a ruling which you take for certainty of tax. Now what the provision says is that if you opt for advance ruling, the advance ruling will be applicable only for 3 years or till the time there is any change in law or fact. So which means it could be good or bad. I mean, there is no conclusion on that, because if I've got a negative advance ruling today, the ruling is applicable only for 3 years and I can go back again to the advance ruling authorities. But if the ruling is positive, I got tax certainty, then also the tax authorities come back to me and recover tax after 3 years. So while the objective of advance ruling is to provide certainty, I do not know that in what way and capacity will this restriction of 3 years be applicable. But I think very importantly, the objective of the FM is to reduce litigation. And that's why frivolous litigation or repeated litigation, she very categorically mentioned that when the matter is sub judice before the jurisdictional high courts or Supreme Court, the department must not go and appeal in certain cases. And the endeavor is certainly to reduce litigation on that front.
Absolutely. So I think overall seems to be like a well-rounded budget so far. Misses are there, hits are there as well. So let's see how everyone takes it from here on as well. Thank you, Abhishek. So that was Abhishek.
I think last one point which I want to mention, just couple of days pre-budget session which we had, I think we touched on certain sectors: infrastructure,
Correct.
education, energy, and digital world. Now, I think interestingly, Hiral, all of those sectors which we mentioned a couple of days back got some sort of proposal or some sort of key initiative or some sort of boost today in the budget speech. So, for example, there was a lot of this thing on logistics and transportation and the infrastructure sector. Similarly, for education, the technology and e-content boost has happened to the education sector. And with respect to the energy sector, there are a lot of these initiatives, including for electric vehicles, where these could be imported in completely knockdown situation and the benefit would come. And of course, we have seen for virtual currency. So I think overall, that theme which we discussed in the pre-budget was more or less the theme even in the budget speech. And we must not forget a very important data and fact that today is the first time when India, the birth rate has decreased as compared to the global birth rate, which means that the birth rate in India today is less than the global birth rate, and the GDP is more than the average of the global growth rate. So from that perspective, if we see the birth rate as compared to the growth rate and what we intend to achieve, I think it is optimistic, but we will be able to achieve that, and we have done that even in the last 1 year and during the pandemic as well. So I think overall, the figures are impressive, and let's see how these proposals turn out to actual procedures and statutes.
Absolutely. Now, execution is going to be key for the government from here on as well. So that was Abhishek Rastogi, partner Khaitan and Company, advocate Supreme Courts and various high courts, joining in. Thank you, Abhishek, so much for joining us on the show, and always great to get insights from you pre-budget as well as to actually slice and dice the budget speech that comes out for all of us and for the viewers. Thank you. Stay safe.
Thank you. Stay safe.
Subscribe to our YouTube channel for in-depth interviews of India Inc. and press the bell icon so that you do not miss our updates.